Tonight we are very, very lucky for our last workshop of season one to have Mikael Karnell, who is development and production craft director at EA Dice. And Mikael is going to talk a little bit about his approach to photogrammetry and how he embraces that workflow for the creation of game art content. So, Mikael, I am now going to just maximize your screen and let you take over from there.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Thank you everyone for joining. So yeah, I'm Michael. Just like Paul said, I work at Dice in Stockholm. So before I start, I just want to do a disclaimer thingy because that's probably appropriate that I'm presenting on my personal behalf and not on behalf of the company in this case, which I normally do, but this presentation is my own personal workflow and not affiliated with um, how we do necessarily do things at work. So just getting that out of the way so I don't accidentally say anything stupid. So yeah, photogrammetry in a studio environment. So normally, um, I guess most people are common or familiar with doing photogrammetry in the field and outside. I'm going to be showing my like prop scanning workflow, which isn't, I haven't invented it or anything. It's more like trial by error and learning from a lot of other great people out there. But hopefully you can learn some things about like the general scanning workflow and some other neat tips and tricks. So before we so going in who I am. So I studied game art at a vocational school in Sweden called Playground Squad. It's one of the most popular game art schools in Sweden, and I did that in 2011 to 2013, so almost 10 years ago, which feels crazy now that I think of it. I did my internship after that education at a studio called Fat Shark in Stockholm, where I worked on not Warhammer, not Vermintide, but I worked on Escape Dead Island. Great game. No, just kidding. It was great fun. Didn't really get the reception that we wanted it to, and that's probably why none of you probably heard of it. But anyway, good experience. And then I worked on several small mobile titles after that, and different random projects that most of them never saw the light of day, as is customary in game dev. And I've also worked a bit in game education in the UK, and ran two different game dev programs at two different schools in Manchester and across the UK. And then I joined Dice in 2018 and started as an art manager, basically managing artists across the studio. And then I also worked as a project manager for art for a little while. And now I'm currently the craft director for producers and project managers, which is basically taking care of that like production and development team. And in the new year, I'm transitioning into back to art because that's where I belong, to work as the lead environment artist. So that's kind of my career, or like a very, very brief overview. Yeah, just some mandatory art stuff. Yeah, we do Battlefield or at Dice. Let's summarize it quickly. Um, and for me, like my kind of dab into photogrammetry started. Well, actually, I can just yeah. So I started with photogrammetry. During the development of Battlefield 2042, and the whole reason why I did that was because I was doing some additional content from one of our Battlefield levels, and I wanted a crab because we were doing like this living world feature, basically all the animals in the game. And instead of just modeling a crab, because that would be too easy, right? I went to this supermarket and bought a Nordic crab and scanned it, and it looked like this. This was my first, attempt at photo scanning. Pretty MacGyvery, if I may say so myself, and pretty newbie as well. I'm surprised that it actually worked, to be honest. And I had nothing like this. The crab, it stank the whole house, and I have nothing to affix it to, so I pierced it on a knife and put the knife into a flower pot. It It's not stupid if it works. And in the end, the crab wasn't even supposed to be a Nordic crab. It was supposed to be a tropical, like Indonesian crab. So I had to rework it and everything to actually have somewhat similar proportions to the real life equivalent. But it was a great base to start off of. And yeah, so that was my first sort of photogrammetry um, try, basically. And so what is photogrammetry? So I'm doing this a bit backwards. So it's for those of you who have never used it or maybe are completely new to it, it's a way to generate 3D models and textures from photos. Like that's basically the gist of it. And now I don't want to talk too much about the technical details because I'll say something wrong. But basically, the the whole gist is you take a bunch of pictures from different angles and the software can figure out based on the pixels of the image when there is like a difference in angle or light and interpret that as a shape and also a texture and generate something from that. So that's very, very simply explained. And it's used extremely heavily in VFX and has been for years. And now it's very commonplace in games as well. And I guess it's seen, an upswing in the past, 10 to 5 years or 5 years especially. Um, and it's very heavily used in those industries. It's also interestingly used by researchers and museums and medical companies as well now, simply because it's allows you to conserve stuff and scan things that you might need to print or analyze different objects or whatever artifacts. So it's not just used for games and sort of entertainment. It's not also to be confused with photometric stereo scanning, which is taking a series of pictures in different or lighting um, setups to scan just materials or textures, and it's not the same thing as laser scanning or 3D scanning, which is using like laser light pulses to scan objects. This is photogrammetry is based on taking photos with a camera. So, for instance, mentioning museums and other researchers using it. This is the ship Vasa in Stockholm, Swedish. You know, what is it like 15th century or even or 14th century galleon almost that sank on its maiden voyage and is one of the crown jewels of the Swedish Swedish heritage basically. And the whole ship was basically lifted up of the out of the ocean outside of Stockholm and put into a museum. And some researchers wanted to kind of conserve the whole thing and generate it in 3D, so you could walk around it and digitally. And so they scan the whole ship using well, not the same approach that I'm going to be showing you, but very similar equipment. And it's also used by like medical companies. And some of you maybe saw this on Twitter the other day. Henning Sandian posted when he went to the dentist and they scanned his teeth to do like a checkup, and then he asked for the ZBrush or like the 3D model and put it into ZBrush. And I mean, so it's it's used by a lot of different for a lot of different purposes. Um, and the main uses of photogrammetry within games and entertainment is primarily for characters, or like, yeah, and that's one use case, replicating real life actors, either faces or full body and clothing as well. And we also use it for environment textures. So, for instance, like patch of grass or cobblestone or sand or rocks or snow or whatever you might like. And so this is Gregors Baran's, one of his tutorials when he's scanning grass to be used as an environment texture. We also use it for environment assets. So this is images taken with a drone. So this is a bit more bigger scale or larger scale. That's also a very common use case, like using drones to capture images of larger like cliffs or even cities, buildings, etc. But we also, of course, also use it for smaller scale environment assets like trees and logs and rocks and yeah, vegetation, all kinds of stuff. And then you can also use it for props, which is my was what I'm going to primarily focus on. And so this is one of my daughter's squeaky toys that I just put through my scanner, and out comes a pretty usable 3D model that looks pretty clean. So some of the advantages of photogrammetry, it's it's the only way to hit true photorealism, I would say. You're free to challenge me on that if you want. Because it is literally taking photographs of real life objects and then generating models and textures from that. So if you are pushing towards photorealism in your projects or in your games, then photogrammetry is the one way to, like, one of the ways to achieve that or hit that uh, realism bar. With and I would argue as well that with a batched or automated workflow, the asset creation time is faster than traditional workflows. Now, this of course depends on the type of asset you're making, what style you're making, what the quality is, etc. Multitude of different factors. But with companies who are using photogrammetry extensively, that's in most cases what they find, that if they have an automated workflow, then the asset creation time is much faster than if they would be doing the regular high poly, low poly kind of workflow. And it also allows for a lot of fun and creative experimentation, because you can, anything you can do with, you know, like in this case from Star Wars Battlefront 1, I think, when they needed like footprints from the AT-AT, they just put um, like flour or whatever the substance was, into a container, and then used like miniature scale AT-AT feet or similar to it anyway, just pressed it down, and then they scanned that and used that as like a height decal, or terrain displacement decal to use in the game when the AT-AT walks in the snow on the Hoth level, or similarly. So it's a so you can do a lot of fun experimentation with just making something and then scanning it and then putting it into a project, something that you might otherwise not have been able to do, or might have taken a very long time to do. So there's it's a fun way to experiment. Some of the disadvantages with photogrammetry is that it does require real assets to scan. I mean, you need to have something to scan, which does make it harder for made up stuff, or very, very specific assets. So if you're going to do like a sci-fi level, then of course that might be more difficult because you're probably not going to have those sci-fi crates or whatever to available to scan, or if it's very, very specific assets, like you need this model of a car or a sofa or whatever it might be, then that can also make it more difficult. Uh, Reuse and kit bashing is more difficult because you're getting a finished asset that is, you know, you don't have as much freedom in how you build the low poly, because if you're retopoing it, for instance, I mean, of course you can do it, but it's normally more work. When you're building an asset using the traditional workflow, you have, like, since you build it from scratch, you have the possibility of thinking more around, like, do we want to use trim sheets here, or do we want to reuse the texture here, or whatever it might be. With photogrammetry and photo scanning, it's you tend to not get as much of that as you would if you're building it from a traditional sense. And also textures are more, of course, more difficult to adjust because you're not getting all the layers, you're just getting one flat texture that you need to use for something, which of course you can clone stamp and edit after that, but what you see is pretty much what you get from the start. And it's not ideal for hard surface assets or shiny and transparent surfaces. And with the hard surface, so for instance, if you want to scan a weapon or a vehicle, then you're better off using a laser scanner or a 3D scanner than photogrammetry, because of there's naturally a noise in images, and that noise creates it in itself noise on the surface of your model. So if you want to have complete 90-degree angle surfaces, and you want to have a really flat, like you're doing a car and you want it to be the polish, or what do you call it, like the surface of the car needs to be very, very smooth and flat, like you're not going to get that. You're going to have a lot of noise in the scan because it's using the photos as a basis for both the textures and the model. So is not ideal for that. It's better off, assets that are slightly irregular, slightly, rougher surfaces or organic surfaces in general. And it's also for shiny and transparent stuff. Of course, if you're scanning like a glass, then you're going to get all the reflections. There's no way of getting rid of all the reflections, and you're going to, have a see-through asset. So unless you use like scanning sprays, for instance, then the model itself is going to be very, very difficult to capture. The same thing with anything that's, very, very reflective or in general. So when it comes to the equipment to have, um, you know, I would suggest buying a dedicated camera, DSLR preferred, of course, and having a lens that's somewhere around 24 to 50 millimeters, simply because you get um, you have less distortion of the surface. Like if you have a longer lens than 50 millimeters, like an 85 or 105 or whatever it might be, then you get a lot of distortion from from the camera lens. 50 millimeters on a full body camera is roughly the equivalent of like the human eye or how we perceive objects. So it's yeah, that's to me is ideal. Or if you have like a 35 millimeter lens, for instance, it's quite good for larger assets. And of course, you need a memory card to capture the images on. You could technically replace all of this stuff with a good smartphone camera. And now there are numerous softwares or phone mobile apps like Reality Capture, I think, released their mobile kind of version where you just take a bunch of pictures and it sends it to the cloud and does all the processing there. And it spits out the 3D model. So there's a lot of possibilities in that as well. There are other software apps as well, like Kiri Engine, for instance, is one that you could also use. But if you're going to do it seriously, professionally, then you're better off investing in a camera and or a drone, because that also helps. So some optional equipment that isn't mandatory, but definitely makes the whole scanning process easier. So one is a color checker or a Macbeth chart or color passport, or have very many names. I'll show it what it looks like if you're not familiar with one in a little bit. A tripod makes scanning a lot easier, especially if you're scanning environment textures. Well, it's not a must, but it just makes your life easier. If you're doing the kind of type of scanning that I'm going to be showing you, then you need to have one, because otherwise it's going to be very, very difficult. It helps if you have a remote release um, shutter or yeah, remote release, because that reduces the amount of vibration you get when you press the camera trigger. So if you use a tripod, then that's great. If you're using it out in the field and you are holding, doing handheld shooting, then that doesn't matter as much, or at all even. But if you're doing like tripod based, then remote shutter is great to have. A polarizing filter is another good investment, or polarizing filters. So there are ones that fit onto the camera, and there's ones that you can put on your external light sources if you use any. And I'll explain a bit more what they do, but they essentially help filter out some of the unwanted glare and specular highlights on surfaces that you might otherwise get. A light meter is I would say not also probably the least necessary investment, but if you do have one, then that's awesome. They're very expensive generally, but a light meter helps you achieve the correct exposure for your camera, and it kind of measures the light and flash and all that sort of stuff. So if you do have one available, then that's definitely of use. And then lastly, an external flash. So the workflow that I'm going to show you requires an external flash. Of course, you don't have to. You can do it in another way as well, but it's gonna make it more difficult or almost impossible to get the sort of roughness map that I'm going to show you how to get an approximation of. So how do you actually scan? So it's important to get full coverage of the surface that you are recreating. It doesn't have to be a full asset, so you don't have to get like a 360-degree cover of the entire thing, because it depends on how you're going to be using your asset. For instance, if you're scanning a tree, then you are not going to be getting like the underside of the tree, because that doesn't matter. It's going to be stuck in the ground anyway, and it's going to be like you're not going to pull down the tree to scan the roots. Like that would be insane. So you only need what what you're actually going to be showing inside of like what you need for your asset. But if you, for instance, do a prop and it's going to be, you know, you need to be able to show the entire prop, then yeah, you need to scan the entire thing unless you do that, you know, you fix the like holes in the asset of whatever you didn't scan in ZBrush or Maya or whatever your 3D package is afterwards. But that's of course not going to look as good in that case. And the entire principle is that either you move the object between shots or you move the camera, and that's, you know, it's either or. And the object shape needs to be the same in every shot because otherwise it's going to confuse the scanning software. Maybe like maybe someone knows of a software that helps you with that, but that definitely is not my experience. So if for instance you're scanning soft body like, you know, fabric or cloth or something, then you need to be very careful if the object itself is being moved through every shot, that it doesn't, you know, you kind of distort or deform the object between, because otherwise it's going to confuse the camera because it's going to assume that the object is the same throughout all of the images, and if it's not, then yes, your results are going to suffer. And try to get as much of the object in the frame. Every sort of pixel counts. So if you um yeah, so you know, don't stand too far away. You know, try to, you know, fill the frame with the object. But this does differ if you're scanning smaller objects like smaller props, because then the depth of field is going to be something that you need to struggle or like battle in some cases. If you're scanning an orange and you move the camera really, really close to the object, then regardless of what aperture of the camera you have set, you're going to get, of course, a much tighter depth of field. So you need to balance that with smaller objects. If you're scanning large stuff, you know, in out in the wild, then that tends to not matter as much. But small objects, that's something you need to be careful with. So some of the challenges with scanning in the field is that it can be difficult or tedious or even dangerous and sometimes even illegal to take good quality photos. And the whole sort of legal consideration around photogrammetry is something that, especially if you're doing it professionally, you need to be aware of it, because not if you're scanning a landmark as an example, then that might be you know, trademarked or you know, copyright or whatever. So you need to be certain that whatever you're scanning, that you are okay to do that. If, for instance, if you're going somewhere uh, and you're scanning something out, you know, in a city or out in the wild, then there also might be like military restricted areas. Sometimes if you're taking photos, especially if you're using a drone, where the police might get involved, like that. That it has happened. A lot of people who have scanned stuff, and it can also be dangerous if you're going, you know, climbing, you know, on cliffs to get the perfect, you know, scan. So you want to be careful around that. And busy backgrounds, like if you're scanning in the wild and you're scanning a rock and you know, you have, of course, you're not going to have every shot filled with the rock. Like you're going to see the background and foliage and trees and whatever. The busier the background, the more difficult it is for the scanning software to isolate the object. And weather is another very annoying thing to have to take into consideration because it impacts your scans a lot. So sun creates really harsh shadows, and you want to, of course, have as diffused lighting as possible so you don't have really strong shadows in your textures afterwards. It also makes the whole, it impacts the whole scan as well because it uses like the shadows to kind of calculate the overall shape. Wind can affect and move objects. So, for instance, between shots, if you're scanning sand, a sand texture, and then all of a sudden, you know, really harsh winds come in, like it might entirely change the layout of, you know, the sand that you're scanning, and so that might also mess up your entire work. And then lastly, like rain, for instance, it yeah just messes up everything because the whole albedo will look different, and all of a sudden you get all these unwanted reflections. So if you're scanning in the wild, you need to be pay close attention to the weather reports. Cloudy weather or overcast is the absolutely best sort of lighting scenario because it's by nature very, very diffused lighting and not very harsh shadows. But yeah, just avoid rain and very strong winds. So on the matter of on the subject of reflections, there is something we tend to call cross-polarization. I'm sure some of you have heard about that in the past. And the whole point is that you want the light as diffused as possible. You want to get rid of unnecessary reflections and highlights. And a polarization filter, I'm not going to go into how exactly it works because I don't fully understand how it works, science, physics. But it helps filter out unwanted glare and specular highlights by basically deciding which sort of light it lets through and what light it doesn't let through, depending on the angle, something like that. And a lens polarizing filter, which is quite common, and I'm sure it's more common to use, and you put it on the screw it or you affix it to the lens, but it only does half the job basically, because you also need to polarize the actual light source. So how do you polarize the sun and or all of the ambient light in a room? Well, the solution in this case is using an external flash. Um, and the way you do that is you overpower the sun or the ambient light with the flash to only include light from that flash, and then you affix a polarizing filter to the flash, and then both the light being cast is polarized, and then when it bounces off of the object into um, the sensor, then the like polarizing filter on top of the lens filters out and polarizes that light as well. So it removes the majority of specular highlights and reflections. So if you look at this, for instance, like the texture here, so this was a melon thing I scanned. So this is the without polarization at all, and then with polarization. So you can see it's a pretty big difference. And it's actually using that difference between these two images to help generate roughness maps as well, which I'll go into a bit more detail later on. So the technique that I'm going to be showing, which I use for small assets, is called scanning in the void. And I didn't come up with that term. It's you can Google it. There's several YouTube videos on this subject. The idea is that you shoot against a black background with a static camera, and then you move the object or like, rotate the object. So you can either use an automated turntable like I do, or you can use like a lazy Susan or lazy Sue, like basically like what do you call it, like a cake thing, like when you do decorate cakes, you can put it on a swivel, and then you rotate the thing, and you do the whole glazing and decorating and everything. It just makes that easier. You can use the same thing to scan. So you just put the object on there, and then you rotate it slightly, take another shot, rotate it, take a shot, rotate it, etc. So in the case that I'm using, it uses an automated approach to do that. So it helps you just set however many images per cycle you want, and then it triggers the camera, rotates it, triggers the camera, rotates it, etc. So you can just press start and then have a glass of wine and wait for it to do its thing. Great. The black background makes it easier for the software to isolate the object. So when you use the polarizing filter, it removes all of those um, annoying sort of specular highlights. So in this case, this image is almost everything else is black and pretty much, and only the giraffe in this case is lit up. And you choose as non-reflective fabrics as possible or surfaces, so it reflects as little light as possible, and then it does the whole full cycle of images, and the scanning software will think that the object is floating in space essentially, and that helps you get a really clean scan. Approach is not suitable for very dark or black objects. So if you want to scan like a PlayStation 4 controller, it's not great for that because it's going to get lost in the background. But other than very, very dark or black objects, this technique worked remarkably well to get a very clean scan with very little effort. So here are some examples of assets that I've put this thing through. So this grenade here, I found at work. Literally, I found it at work. Well, it makes sense because we scan a lot of props and stuff for our games. So this was a World War One grenade. So I just put it out on this on the turntable. It did its thing, and I did zero cleanup to this mesh after I just baked the textures, and that was it. So it does have its uses. even though it might be limited to some degree, especially considering size and everything. But if you want to scan larger things, then just get a bigger turntable. Um, so let's look at and do some, actual demo assets here. So we're gonna scan a piece of firewood that escaped my what do you call it? Fiery thingy where you put log burner. That's the one. And so I'm gonna see here, change my camera so you can actually see what I'm doing instead. Here we go. So can you see me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so before we get going, this is a color passport. So it has pre-calibrated colors based on like a set standard, and the colors, are universally the same. So the software like Photoshop or whatever, it knows that this red is red, and regardless of what you kind of lighting scenario you have, that red, then it knows that, well, if this color is red, then I need to do these, this sort of color adjustment to make it this red in the picture. So it's great for getting the correct white balance. You can also use it for setting exposure and do all kinds of stuff. So very, very handy. Um, and we use these, like if you're doing this professionally or just want a high quality scan, you put this next to the object that you're scanning for one picture, and then you color calibrate it based on the color passport. So you get the correct white balance. And because the camera, like any camera, will always have a bunch of setting of its own that it's trying to, kind of sell you to make the picture more visually pleasing, but we want as natural images as we possibly can get. So that's why we use this. So the other things that I mentioned, remote shutter, yeah, just looks like this. Scanning spray, you can get that online. Just be careful with this stuff because it's really difficult to get rid of. I've sprayed a lot of stuff around the house and it's forever like white grayish now. Another really useful accessory for this sort of stuff, lint roller. You get a lot of dust and fine hairs and other stuff when you on black fabric. So lint roller is this lifesaver in this case. Another cool thing is this thing. It's called a Wimbley clamp. Like Wimbley, they make all kinds of different products. This is the purpose for this is actually macro photography. So the idea is you put like a pole in the ground and then you clamp the thing shut, and then you use this little clamp to hold like small flowers and stuff in place. Now this can be used instead if you put that on the turntable and you affix a flower or whatever small thing that won't stand up by itself. You just put that in there and then you scan it that way. So yeah, just or you 3D print something to hold your objects in place. I did, for instance, yeah, I took a Coca-Cola can, glued some other black fabric to it, and used that as like a little pedestal thing when I was scanning like apples and other things. Worked great. So live demo thing here. What could possibly go wrong? So this is the camera that I have. So I have a Z7, Nikon Z7 mirrorless camera. Now, hopefully, you should be able to. If I well, actually, let's wait. So I have all sorts of cables hooked up to this thing to do its job. I have a ring flash. It's called a Ricoh 400. I know that Jason Ord purchased a very, very similar setup. Gregors Baran, another amazing photo scanning dude working at Ubisoft, also has a pretty much exactly same one. They might be called different things because they are under different license names, different parts of the world, but it's literally the same flash. And this is a ring flash that produces almost near shadowless light. So the camera, it has the same angle as the light itself, so you don't really like if you have flashes from other directions, it's going to create harsh shadows by itself. But by using a ring flash, it creates almost completely no shadows, which is what we want. So on top of this, so on the camera lens itself, I have a polarizing filter. On the um, flash, I have a polarizing filter. You can either 3D print something like this, or just buy it online like I did from New Zealand. Great. Uh, Even though I have a 3D printer at home. And then yeah, I have flash triggery thing on top. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And then if you invest money into anything, but to be fair, like all of this stuff is crazy expensive. But if you do invest money into anything, like get a really good tripod, because the tripods don't get the cheap ones because they are horrible. You won't be able to trust them basically. So don't skimp on the tripod. Is what I'm saying. Now, if we go into, aha, pretty cool. Well, wasn't expecting that. So here we have the camera view. No expense spared. I'll see if I can just show you basically. So we're scanning this log, and as you can see, the whole thing here is that we are. Uh, yeah. So if you look at the numbers here at the bottom, so we have the aperture at the highest it goes on this lens, which is f16. The shutter speed right now is 3 seconds. Now that's not great, but that's the way. Like if I turn that down, you'll see it just gets darker, darker, and darker. Now, if I use the flash right now, then the image would be incredibly overexposed, and also I would still get light from the room, like all the ambient artificial light right now that allows me to see what I'm doing. So the idea is that we set the shutter speed so that we don't see anything. So like 200. So now it's completely black. Now if I switch on the flash, now then voila, you can now see, well, this is the camera doing its thing. This is not really the image itself. But if I take a photo and then let's look at that photo. Wait, why is it doing this? Aha, wait. So there we go. So now you can see this is what with the flash what I get, and this is with cross-polarizing and everything. Oh, cross-polarization. So the image is basically completely. Oh, the background is completely dark here. And now everything went. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so the image is almost completely. Well, it is basically completely black. And then, so the idea is to take 360-degree coverage of this. The software will think the object is just floating there. The cool thing is that because it's doing that and it doesn't know that the object is in fact standing on something, what we can do when we need to scan the underside of this is we just do that, put it down, and then raise up the platform, and then do the same thing. Well, maybe a bit lower because otherwise you're going to see the whole thing underneath. But yeah, something like that. Now, if I take another picture, and then let's look at that. Yeah, basically same thing. Like you can see a little bit of the platform, but we can edit that out in the scanning software. And the cool thing is that the software won't notice any difference. Like it will think that you have moved the camera and not that the object is moved. Now this works great for solid objects, like in this case this wooden log, because the shape itself isn't going to deform if I turn it upside down. If I had like I tried this with like a leather bag, for instance, that was scanning for a scene, that did not work. So because the whole thing just deformed if I flipped it upside down. And then, remember what I said about the shape needing to be the same? Well, it wasn't anymore, and so the scanning software didn't really know what was going on. So what I do now let me change back to me again, is I have this little automatic turntable. This is called a Myops Capsule 360. There are different ones that you can purchase, like the Syrup. It's a brand. They also do these same automatic turntable thingies. Now this has an app. Um, so you So I'll show you what that looks like. You just connect it to the camera or like the turntable thingy. And then there is lots of different functions, like you can do stargazing or like star tracking and all kinds of cool stuff with this. And then you go to the turntable function, and in here you can decide how many images do you want per um, turn, or like it just says frame 36, and also how many seconds between each shot. And yeah, that's basically it. And then you just press start. Now I use 36 because 36 divided by um, 360 degrees is 10. So it takes one image per 10 degrees. Now, there's a reason why I do that, and it's because it's an easily divisible number. So when I do two cycles of the object, one with cross-polarization and one without polarization to generate the roughness, then when this image has done a full spin, a full cycle, then the object is going to return to the exact same original position as it was from the start, which then allows me to just rotate the polarization filter, take another turn, and then the images will almost perfectly line up when I subtract the, let's see, the cross-polarized one from the not cross-polarized one, and to get a roughness approximation. So if I had this at like 50, then that's not fully divisible. And so then it would end up and start in different ways, and it would be all out of sync. So what I do is I press start, and then yeah, you can see behind me here, it just does its thing. Now let's go to camera view. Now normally, of course, I would line it up better so it's not, half of the frame. But so one issue here, or something that I've yet to find a really really good approach for, is the fact that either you set the focus of the camera to manual and you just focus in the center of the object, which works great for like spherical objects. If you're scanning an apple, for instance, then it's not going to matter. If you're scanning something like this, that's not spherical, then the focus is going to be different depending on like so in some areas it's not going to be fully focused. You could use on modern cameras like focus tracking, so you say to it like you should always keep this point in focus and then do several spins. I haven't experimented too much with that yet, because the results are okay-ish. Like they're not perfect, but they are okay. Um, so you can see, for instance, now, the furthermost part of the wooden log around here is not getting full focus. But you could solve that by just taking more images. I mean, that's what you would do if you were doing it out in the wild. The reason why it's a bit more finicky is because if I'm doing the roughness thing, I want the cross-polarized image and the non-polarized image to be exactly the same, like the exact same angle, exact same place of the camera, so there's no movement in between them, because then they're not going to line up and then it's all ruined. So that's why it's a bit more finicky. Anyway, we could watch this all day, but we're not going to, because like chefs on TV, I have prepared everything already. Um, so once I've taken all of the photos, I end up with a folder full of raw images, and I divide them into cross-polarized images and uh, non-polarized images, or parallel polarized images, as they would be called. So if we open some of these up, we can compare them. So here's a cross-polarized one, and then let's open up a non-cross-polarized one. So let's do that. So yeah, you can see the difference. It's not a perfect lineup, which creates slight artifacts. Um, I'm working on a solution where the whole rotating of the polarization filter is done by an automated roboty thing. Much like if you have like an advanced stereoscopic scanning rig where you just flips the filter for you between shots, but I've not gotten that far yet. But it's solvable, like everything. So what I do then is because I get the raw images, I need to convert those to TIFFs in Photoshop. Well, you don't have to use Photoshop. You can use whatever you want. You can use Lightroom or any of the other image processing software out there. Normally you would want to get rid of like vignetting and a lot of other, do a lot of other fancy camera calibration stuff. I'm not going to be doing any of that because I don't have time. But I'm going to show you kind of what the overall workflow is in a very simple way, and that only requires Photoshop. So I open all these images up. And I beat myself to it. So here we have all these images. So here's the one with this color, like the first one with the color passport. And I have the full cycle of cross-polarized images here. So what I do is just Control A, select all the images, and then do color picker in like this middle gray here, um, like that. And then it color corrects all of the images to this neutral gray, which then gives me like natural color correction, the right white balance and everything. You could do exposure, set the correct exposure using this as well. I've just used the histogram meter in the camera to get an okay exposure, but whatever floats your boat. So at that point, what I do is just select all of the images and then go to this little export button. Now this is super, super handy. Photoshop has a great export function. So you just select whatever folder you want, set the file format, and then um, what the images should be called. Now I use a numbering, and the numbering here is very, very important if you're going to do the roughness sort of calculation. So I set that to 1, and then I reset it to 1 when I do it the same kind of process for the non-polarized images, because then the basically this one and this one are both called 1 and not DSC something random, because when you do the when you bake the textures in, for instance, Agisoft, it goes by name. So I'll show you how that works in a little bit. Yeah, so let's go to, I've exported all these images, pretend that I'm doing it right now, and we have all these wonderful TIFF images ready to be used in our scanning software. Now I'm not gonna say which scanning software you should use. There are several different great options. In this case, we're using Agisoft, Metashape. And the workflow here is that you add the photos. So you just select all of them. You can see here, they're all in here. And then you start by going to workflow and then align photos. Now, you can set this to low, or I'm going to set it to low anyway, so it doesn't take as much time. And then just click OK. Now it's going to calculate, based on all these photos, how do they all line up, basically. And you'll get a preview of roughly the sort of shape that it interprets within your photos. So we'll see how long this takes. Should be pretty quick because it's a simple object and we've only got 72 images. If you're doing larger stuff with hundreds of images, then of course all of this takes much, much, much longer. And there we go. So here you can sort of see what the camera thinks that I've done. It thinks that I've taken, the first cycle of images like this, and then that I've gone around the object some magical way like this. But what I've actually done is to just flip the object, but the software doesn't know. So you get, look at this nice alignment and perfect distribution. It's amazing. So this is the rough like point cloud-ish thing of this mesh, and it looks pretty good already. So what I can do now is go to here, just build mesh. Excuse me. And in this case, I will just set it to low. Low. And click OK. And now it's going to generate a mesh for me. So there's a reason why I'm just generating a very, very rough mesh to start. And it's not only because of time, but then I can use that mesh as a mask for all of my photos, because what you will see now, most likely, is that some of the platform that I had this log on will appear in my scan. So it's doing its thing. Just going to check the chat if there are any questions? Oh God. Okay, we'll do that later. Um, yep. Let's see.
Just while that's working, Michael, quick question.
Mm,
Obviously, I think Agisoft and Reality Capture are probably the two main programs that are used for
yep.
photogrammetry. Are there any obvious or profound differences between the two? Have you used Reality
I
Capture
have
as well?
I haven't actually, so
Okay.
I would be not the best person to answer that question.
Hmm.
We do. So I said I wasn't going to talk about work, but we do use both at work, depending on the preference of the artist. So it just depends on whatever you're most familiar with. There will be some slight functionality differences between the two.
Hmm.
I find Metashape to be fantastic. Like it does such a good job, and it's also fully like you can write Python scripts for it as well, which I've used in some cases for very specific solutions. So if you want to do, automated batched workflows, Metashape is great for that.
Okay.
So now you can see we get this mesh. It looks terrible. Like this isn't the texture. These are vertex colors that it creates for us. So we can view the mesh here, just the solid mesh, just harsh normals. Looks really crappy. And then we can look at the wireframe as well. So this isn't a very dense mesh. It's very, very quite low poly. But the purpose of this is that now I just clean this up a little bit, just get rid of all this black platformy stuff. So the way I can do that is, and I've bound some hotkeys here. So I'm using the navigation thing to move the object around, and then we have this freeform circle selection mode thingy that I can select things with. I just um, bound those to some hotkeys to make this whole thing simpler, because otherwise you have to do a lot of clicking. So you can do that in the options, and then you just, oops, wrong one. Just select all of this stuff and just get rid of it. Delete, delete, delete. Um, so yeah, this can take a little bit, or I just go to a pre-made scene that I have here somewhere. Fancy that. Where did that go? Ta-da! Okay, okay, there we go. So here we go. I've deleted all of that platformy stuff, and I've also just baked a very, very quick texture. So this is what uh, you know, yeah, this is what that looks like with the vertex colors, and then this is what it looks like with the texture. So uh, and the texture you bake just by pressing build texture. So this is still the low poly version. So we can go to the wireframe where it's kind of a low poly one, slightly more dense than the one I showed just now. And the idea now is that if I go to these images here, I want to build a really, really high ultra quality version of this, but I don't want to have to go through and get rid of all the platforming bits again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a mask for all these photos. So I suggest select all the photos and then go import mask, and then you can set, either you can import an image as a mask, like you can do this in a multitude of different ways. You can use a green screen, or you can use like, for instance, if you don't have this black or like it works even if you have a black background, but if you take an empty a picture of this whole thing without the object, and then you can subtract the empty platform with the black background from all the other photos which has the log in it, and then it's going to create a mask from that. You can do that as well. So it's pretty clever in that way. Or you can just use the model in this case. So if I just press OK, you can see it's going to import the model as a mask. And right now you can see, so if I go through these images, pretty cool. So now it knows that, well, this is the outline of the object. So it just uses the model as a mask for the images. So now if I go back and go back to my model here, I'm going to do a batch process. So click batch, and then you can add the like align photos option. So we're gonna redo this entire mesh based on the photos that are now masked with the low poly version of this log here. And we're just gonna set ultra quality on everything. So high accuracy on the aligned photos. We're gonna get a build mesh thing here, set that to ultra and high face count, or just set it custom 10 million, whatever you want. And then we're gonna do a build texture one as well. Here, these are the options for the build texture mode. Just leave them as they are by default, and then you just change the resolution. So whatever you want, 8K, 16K, doesn't matter. And in this case, like the cool thing here now is that if I just press OK, it's gonna start doing all these things without me having to like go and, oh, did it align the photos? Okay, now I can build a mesh. So if you want to leave your computer on overnight, you can do that. That's very common. That you do that, and then it can have like a save project after each step. So when it's aligned photos, you can save, build, save, etc. I tend to have that unticked because if it messes up the aligned photos thing, for instance, then I don't want it to overwrite my project as it was right now, just in case. So I don't tend to do that. Or you just save a copy. I mean, that's probably a more clever way of doing that of the project. And then you just press OK, and then it's gonna do its thing. Luckily, I've done that step as well ahead of time. So, and I'm just conscious of time now, and I know we're already at an hour.
It's
Goodness
all good.
gracious.
It's all good.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So here's the high quality version of this log. Now, if we look at the wireframe on this, yeah, this is the wireframe. Yeah, you can see it's pretty dense. So this is 4 or 5 million faces. So fairly dense mesh. Now this I just export. So click export and then export the model. Just set whatever, just call it scan high, and then you also now I don't want to do that because I'm going to replace it. But then it gives you the option to export the texture as well, and what format you want the texture to be exported as. Just use TIFF because that's the best, I think, personally. And now what we're going to do, we're going to so here. So we have now this texture, and this texture is the cross-polarized version. It's without any extra unwanted highlights. Now I want to get the texture that is not polarized so I can generate my roughness map. Now what I do, and this is the cool part, is just I right click on one of the images and then go to change path and then make sure that it's selected to all cameras. Now I go into my raw folder. Instead of the cross-polarized images that I've just used to generate this mesh, I go into the parallel polarized ones, and then yeah, this one is going to show up. And here's the reason why I wanted it to be numbered the exact same way, because now it's going to understand that, we can see this happening live. It replaces those same images with the non-polarized version. Now, if I try to align and recreate an entirely new mesh, you would have completely different UVs. It would be completely different position. It might not even align properly because of all of the extra highlights and everything. So doing this approach is actually extremely, yeah, it just works really, really well. So now it's updated all of those images. I can go and build a new texture, do the same thing, just make sure that the mapping mode is set to keep UV so it doesn't create completely new UVs for this mesh. And then it's going to do its thing. Da, 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 da. Mm-hmm. Should get some elevator music for this. Oh, there we go. So then you can see it's been updated with the yeah, the non-polarized version of this texture. So now I can just export only the texture. So I just go to export and then export the texture, and then just, yeah, make that a TIFF as well, and then name it so you remember which one is which, even though you'll probably see which one is which. So if I go to my folder where I've done all of this already, I now have a high scan would log scan high. Like this is the Uber 5 million polygon mesh, and I have my two textures. So I have the cross-polarized albedo and the non-polarized albedo. So you can see there's a slight difference in there's some distortion, tiny little bit, um, and that's because the camera vibrated when I rotated the filter. So this is why I want to have some kind of automated thing that doesn't create any vibrations and or alignment issues. And you can see the UVs here are terrible. So, but that's the auto UVing function within the scanning software itself. So now we go to ZBrush. Yay! And so here I have the mesh imported, so the raw scan. Now you can do anything you want with this mesh, basically. If you want to, use like a clay polish, for instance, to remove some noise, or if you, for instance, if you're scanning fabric and you want to reinforce some of the folds that maybe didn't capture that well, you can do that. Like the Dama standard and the clay tubes brushes are great for that kind of work. But I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to make a copy of this mesh that I'm going to see remesh. So I've just made a copy, used C remesh here, and then set it to something quite ambitious. So this has gone from 2.5 million vertices to 5,000 instead. So that's a pretty good reduction, and this looks somewhat clean ish. Now, what you can do if there's a massive difference in the shape and overall shape of your retopoed version from your high poly, like your raw scan version, what you can do is if you've UV this, which I luckily have, so just use the UV master and, or wait, maybe I haven't. No, I haven't. Okay, let's do that. Oh, there we go. Quick. We have some UVs. Also, not the best UVs in the world, but who cares? Now what we can do is we can go to this object, unhide the raw one, and then go to project, and then project all. Now there's not a big of a difference because I've already done this step, but what it does is it tries to project low poly onto the high poly, so it follows the shape somewhat, and that's a good way to make sure that it um, the low poly itself also has as similar to this shape as possible. Now you can do anything you want, just export, clean, whatever, this mesh up. So I've exported it, and I've gone to Maya and redone the UVs a little bit to make them better. Now what I do is I go to Marmoset, and this is the final version. So we're gonna hide out and hide out, and then just go to the baker. Now this is also not necessarily the most like the best possible workflow. What a lot of people do at this point is that they export the low poly back into Metashape and then reproject the textures that way. But I'm not going to do that because I find that this works good enough. So what I do is I bring in the high poly scan, the raw scan, bring in the low poly that I've just exported from ZBrush and fix the UVs slightly. And then to the material for the high poly, I assign the in the albedo slot, I put in my albedo, a cross-polarized albedo, and then cheekily in the emissive slot, I put in my non-polarized albedo. And there's a reason for that, because then in my baking options, I bake all out everything that you can possibly find, just because you never know. And I also include the baking out the albedo and the emissive channels in this case. And then I press bake, and out I get lots of nice baked textures. Oops, rid of this. And so here we have the albedo, and I have, if I open up the emissive, I have the same thing, but non-polarized version here. And I have my ambient occlusion and all of that stuff. So now I go into Substance Designer. And in Substance Designer, I bring all of my textures, and I first get like the delighter, photoscan delighter node, which is really nice. It's great at delighting textures even further. Question if you need this or not. I use it anyway. And in this, you just get the texture that you are delighting. So in this case, we have the albedo here that is cross-polarized, and then we plug in uh, um, an object-based normal map and an ambient occlusion map. And that, through its magic, helps delight this a little bit further. So here's the difference between yeah, you can see. It's a slight difference. And then I do the exact same thing for the non-polarized one. And then the magic of, getting some sort of roughness map approximation is by converting this from using the sRGB to linear RGB sRGB node. So we convert this from non-linear to linear, and then I subtract the cross-polarized albedo from the not cross-polarized albedo. And technically, what you're left with then is the specular highlights, or whatever you want to call it. And you can see there is, some issues here where it doesn't align. But if you are more careful when you do the whole scanning thing, then it's pretty good. And then convert to grayscale, do some auto leveling, invert it, and do some more leveling to adjust. Now, is this a perfectly technically scientifically accurate way of generating a reference map? No, probably not. Does it give a good enough base to work on? I think so. When I've used it for several objects, metallic, non-metallic, and it gives me more to base off of than just using the albedo by itself. Um, Maybe I'm imagining that, hallucinating. I don't know, but it's yeah, it's interesting. If anyone has a more like scientific way of doing this, or has any objections like no, that doesn't work, you shouldn't be doing that, then I'm all ears, because I kind of made this up a little bit. So, um, but yeah, and then yeah, just plug everything in, export the textures, and then in Marmoset you get something. Wait, where did it go? Oh, yeah, I guess something like this with a little bit of height map enabled and everything. And yeah, that's it. I think I've gone through everything.
That's super cool. I've seen some photogrammetry workflows, but I've never seen the roughness map generation aspect of it before. So that's really interesting to see how you kind of like configured that to give you that as like an additional aspect of the process as well. Really cool.
Thank you.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I can't take credit for anything. I've read it online and then tried it, and I don't want to. And again, I have no idea if this is the right way of doing it. The research on this topic is quite limited, so if you try Google it, it's like
yeah,
there's not much resources on it. So I think it's a matter of trialing and seeing like if it works. And if anything, just using it as a base to then do further editing on,
exactly. Yeah,
it gives you something. It's an artistic approximation, regardless. At the end of the day. So
absolutely, absolutely. We have a few questions, if that's okay. We'll jump
yep,
into those
of
now.
course. Yep.
So I think the first one is from me. So yeah, photogrammetry obviously has a lot of benefits. Like it gives you ways of creating specifically real world assets with that photorealism aspect embedded in them.
hmm
However, uh, does it cause issues in terms of if you're going to incorporate photogrammetry based assets into your environment? and you have other assets which are not photogrammetry based. This is often a question I wondered about, like for games. If you're using photogrammetry rocks or photogrammetry whatever, does it kind of like then offset or kind of make it difficult for traditional workflows to also be used in the same environment?
Yeah, it's definitely a consideration, because you do notice that quite a stark difference, especially between like and I'm going to do my best not to talk about work here,
Yeah.
but if you're doing scanned environments and non-scanned props, the difference is big.
Yeah.
And in some cases that can be quite harsh, like because you notice that, well, this is like looks really generic in contrast to the scanned, like
Yeah.
nature assets. Um, and in that case, like I think there's not necessarily like the one way to get around that, if you don't want to scan like props and stuff because of the hassle, or simply because it's not necessarily the most time effective way to do stuff. At least if you scan materials that you can use, so you have like scanned concrete, scanned wood, scanned metal, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
plastic,
Mm-hmm.
then at least that's going to be a lot better than if you were just eyeballing it completely in Painter to get something that looks okay-ish, because it's gonna look more like more stylized, or more
Yeah.
a little bit more cartoony. Um, so I think that's probably,
The way
I
to
don't
go.
know. I don't know if there's a great way around that. I think it's just that's when art direction really needs to
Comes into play.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah, come to the play. So you decide, well, what's okay, what's not okay. Like how far do we want to go with like scan? Do we want to scan other assets other than just nature?
Yeah.
Do we want to scan surfaces? In some cases it can help to kind of have a blend between, so like the difference isn't too big. Like say if you have a ground material that is based on photogrammetry scan, and you have an asset that's not sitting on top of it, like the difference is going to be really big. If you have, I don't know, like um, mesh scatter, or something that you can scatter on the ground that also is not photo scanned, that kind of like helps
Break it up a
be
little bit.
act yeah break up, yeah, exactly, and act somewhat as the middle ground, then
Yeah.
maybe that can help. But yeah, you just need to have a really keen eye as an artist and as an art director to decide on, like, well, does this look good together, or is the difference too jarring?
Okay. That's interesting. Interesting. Okay. Next question is from James. I think potentially you may have talked about this already. This may have been asked because I think James said he missed part of it. But for those wishing to get into photogrammetry, where is an easy and ideal starting point to learn, and what equipment and software? So you've covered the equipment and software. Maybe just answer the part where it's where would you start if you wanted to learn sort of this process? Have you got any kind of like good resources or places to start?
Yeah, I think if you Google, like, Gregor Baran is the person I would recommend,
Could
like his
you,
YouTube videos.
when you
Yeah,
get a
I can
chance,
link.
drop a
I
link?
can, yeah. He's amazing. Massive fan of his work, and he does a really, extremely good explanation. And he's bought, on incidentally, or maybe because he's done the exact same research as I have to some extent, but he's gone way deeper on many of these topics. He's bought the almost the exact same equipment as I have. And he's done a great walkthrough of a very similar process, or like general environment texture scanning process, and with different software as well, comparing the techniques to different both different softwares, but also different approaches of doing it. There's also another person, trying to remember his name, Kristen. I'll post his name as well.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Based in New Zealand. He's also got a really good YouTube videos of the scanning in the void technique. That's from where
Where
it's
you
from
got it
him that I
from?
learned it. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then I tried it, and it's like, oh my god, this works wonders.
Yeah. Cool.
So credit where credit is due. I'll post those channels.
Yeah.
If I was starting out, I would actually just get one of those free apps and just use it on your phone if you have a smartphone. So either like Kiri Engine or the Reality Capture, I think it is, has a smartphone
Yeah.
app where you just take those photos with your mobile camera, and then it uploads it into the cloud, and generates a mesh for you.
Yeah. See how you get
I
on
would
with that to
experiment with
start.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
good advice. Cool. Next question is from Salvador. When scanning bigger scaled assets, does texture quality, or i.e., texel density, become an issue when you have such large assets to work with?
Yes. And in those cases, usually the scanned the texture that you get from the mesh, we use that as a base, and then you use a bunch of detailed textures on top to get crisper results. So if for instance, if you're scanning like large cliffs or get like really large natural assets, you would um, most certainly use a drone because it would be almost impossible otherwise, especially if you're doing stuff, say around an ocean, like that you beach cliffs or whatever. You need a drone for that because otherwise you're not going to be able to get that coverage. And in those cases, like the resolution of that image sensor, it works for the mesh, but it's not great for the textures itself. Like you can use it as a basis for your albedo, and the mesh is good enough to, you can polish it up in ZBrush or similar, but overall you will need to use additional textures blended on top to get crisp enough results.
Yeah, the fidelity you want. Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
Cool. Next question, I believe, is from Nyla. So I don't know if you've had a chance to use the Reality Scan app, but her question is, what are your thoughts on the Epic Games Reality Scan app, and is it worth learning, I guess, photogrammetry or that app for the average 3D artist? Pros and cons.
I haven't used that one. I've only seen it briefly pop up. I don't know if someone else here has used it, but I would just try it because the one that I've used is called Kiri Engine, so Kiri. That one was actually remarkably good, just testing it out really, really quickly. And I don't know, like maybe just for the sake of, if you want to use it like as a portfolio piece, or if you want to learn the workflow to be used like for your sake, for the sake of like your portfolio or like as a skill, then personally I would recommend just getting a trial of like, or of like say Metashape or reality capture or on any of the other software, or just buying a student or indie license and do it that way, because we I don't think that many studios that uses photogrammetry as a workflow would be using the mobile
Yeah,
apps
yeah, yeah,
simply
yeah.
because of the quality. But I think just to get exposed to it, to try it out, and also because you might not carry a camera with you at all times, and if you notice something, maybe that's the entryway. If that's the entryway to you like doing it and realizing, well, this is freaking awesome,
Yeah,
then that's what you should be doing. If you want to, if I want to, this looks, super cool, I want to do this for my next environment, then yeah, probably would do it a bit more, in a bit more conscious way. Get a camera if you're able to. If not, use your smartphone and then try one of the scanning softwares on your desktop, so you
cool,
have greater control of the end results.
cool. Sounds good. Quickly, just for me, so not a question, but if you could put, you mentioned the make of the turntable that you were using. If you could drop that into the workshop chat as well,
I can do indeed.
that would be fantastic. So the next question is from Glenn. So Glenn asks, have you got any experience with using LiDAR that comes with the new iPhones? He's had a go with that, but he finds that there's some blur or smearing in the textures and wondering if you have any tips for reducing this.
I haven't. I mean, we have again, not mentioning work. Studios do use lidar, especially for like terrain scanning. I haven't used it in on the phone. That I didn't even know that they had that. That's really cool. So I'm afraid I can't answer questions around like why
Okay.
the issues that you are having, what that might be of. But lidar is definitely uh, used, and I'm not entirely sure, but I think it is a fairly similar technology that is used for the handheld like laser scanners that you can get, like 3D scanners, because there's also light impulses that scans the surface and then gives back a 3D model. Those are insane. If you want to Google those, like laser 3D scanner or whatever, um, yeah, they cost like 100,000 quid. So not
Yeah,
for the every if every person is going to be able to afford that, but they are really really cool. If you need, like, that's for like for characters and for hard surface stuff, that's the future. That's
yeah,
what
the
we
way it's
would use.
going. Okay, cool. Next question, we've got a couple of more, Michael. Regarding focus, this is from Daniel. So I think you talked about using, I think it was a 50 millimeter setup because
Hmm.
it kind of resembles the human eye. Daniel
Hmm.
asks, what about using an 85 mil and dropping the f-stop? You would get a deeper area focus. Could you do that as well?
Well, the reason why we're talking about like the 50 millimeter 35 to 50 millimeter isn't because of the aperture. It's because of the focal length of the lens. So the higher focal length you have, like so 85 millimeter is that traditional like portrait lens, because that's where the like what we decide, humans, we
Hmm.
think that human faces look more flattering in that kind of range, like 85 to 105. That's like the golden ratio for portrait lenses. Um, and like say if you, so for instance, like if you're taking photos of wildlife, you would most likely use like a 150 to a 600 or 800 millimeter lens. I have a 600 millimeter lens myself, like birds photography. Like because it's a telephoto lens and it's got a very high focal length, it distorts the image quite extensively. So, for instance, if you Google like focal length distortion, it's very common in movies to create like effects by shifting the focal length of the lens to make something look like eerie. So, for instance, what's his name? Super epic old film director. I'll remember his name in a bit. Used that in like the film. Oh my god. Okay. What's it called when you're afraid of heights? What's that called? Uh,
Oh,
uh,
my brain has
whatever.
just died.
Yeah, but yeah. So Steve
Vertigo.
posted it.
Vertigo.
Vertigo,
There you
exactly. Yeah,
go.
exactly. Yeah. So in that film, they used that to kind of like zooming down the clock tower, and they used
Hmm.
the focal length to kind of make the image feel like the height is much greater than it actually is. And they use that like in Jaws, for instance, when they have like sudden realization scenes. You can see that. So anyway, that's beside the point. But the fact is that the size of an object shifts quite drastically. So in the video that Steve now posted in the chat, you can see the big difference between so in that case the 15 millimeter lens and an 800 millimeter lens.
Yeah.
Um, so that's why if you use like a 50 millimeter, then it is kind of like a pretty good standard way of getting uh, a representation of the object to what we are used to seeing with the like human eyes. And 35 is okay as well, but within that range.
Okay.
You can like 85 is fine. Like I don't think you would have that big of an issue. But if you were going like 150, then yeah, your objects, not only would you have to go so much further away from the object as well to fit it in the frame, which is an issue in itself, which then causes more vibration and bigger difficulty in getting a good focus of the image. Um,
So
yeah,
35 definitely just suits better for what you're
yeah,
doing. Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, cool. That's really detailed. I think this is the last question. I'll double check, but I think this is the last one. On average, this is
Mhm.
James again. From scanning phase to finished rendered asset, how long does it typically take to I guess, do this process in production?
Um, so there is a great presentation on photogrammetry workflows that Andrew Hamilton did from Star Wars Battlefront 1 at GDC. If you haven't watched that or seen that, I would greatly recommend you do. Like, of course, a lot of the workflows there are some of them are quite outdated now because that was years ago, but it shows the kind of way of thinking around photogrammetry and also the difference in quality between like the latest Battlefield game that was released just before Star Wars Battlefront 1, and how the photogrammetry played such a huge part in hitting that visual fidelity. So in that presentation, they have an overview of like the traditional asset creation time and the photogrammetry asset creation time, and it's like more than halved. So I can't say like specifically because it depends on whatever workflows you have. And for us at work, it's slightly different because we have several, automated workflows that kind of speeds the process up a lot, and that's what most studios who are doing photogrammetry seriously, like Embark as an example. Yeah, so Joe just posted that GC talk in the chat.
Oh, nice.
Thanks, Joe. And so Embark, for instance, you can read on a lot of their articles because they are also like working on this one-click photogrammetry solution thing where you just get the images, click one button in Houdini, and it automates the entire process. And
Wow.
that's very common within, I'm not going to say it's very common, but studios who are using and relying on photogrammetry a lot, they'll be exploring those sort of workflows, and that obviously reduces asset creation times a
A lot
lot,
as
a lot,
well.
a lot, a lot.
Yeah.
Especially if you have multiple assets, so you just then drop things images into a folder from a scan trip. And I mean, from a scan trip, if you're going and scanning somewhere, you might be getting several 50,000 images, hundreds of assets depending on what you do, and then of course you want to automate as much as possible of that.
Hmm.
So that, yeah, just improves asset creation times so much. So I don't know, like
Hard to
it depends
answer. Yeah,
completely.
it's
Yeah, hard to
difficult.
answer exact numbers, but it's much faster,
Okay. Okay.
generally.
Cool. Michael, I want to thank you very, very much, and apologizing for getting your name pronunciation wrong at the start of the
That's
talk.
fine.
So
That's
that's
fine.
my fault. But that was a wonderful insight into the whole process of photogrammetry. I found it super informative. The
Thank you.
presentation was fantastic. The whole kind of like setup between the transitions and cuts between your camera and the whole presentation was just phenomenal. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to go through that and get that set up for us. I really much appreciate it. It's a great way to end off sort of our first season of workshops here in XYZ. It's also motivated me, I think, to experiment with this technique a little bit more. I've dabbled in it very briefly, but it's definitely something I want to revisit and try out again in the new year. And I think your talk has definitely inspired me to do so. So, just thank you very, very, very much. If someone could drop Michael's socials
Yeah,
into the
Roxy's
chat.
already done that, I
Oh,
saw.
Roxy's done it. Okay, cool. I don't have
Yeah,
that open in front of me. Brilliant. So if you're
thanks.
not following Michael on ArtStation on Twitter, please do. Fantastic artist. Brilliant, brilliant work throughout, and just really appreciate you being here and taking the time this evening. So thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
It was a pleasure. And I saw as well, and thanks for all the nice comments. And I saw that Ben, the substance master himself, actually said that it was an okay way of doing this. So I take that as a seal of
If
approval.
Ben says it's okay, it's
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
right?
I'm happy about that. So yeah, thanks for that, Ben.
That's cool.
And
Super cool.
thank you all for joining. Thanks, Paul, for hosting. And yeah,
Cool.
please reach out if you have any questions, and have a great rest of your evening.